On today's episode of the Midweek Ramble, I'll be sharing with you my 6 top tips and all that you need to get yourself started on the road to knitting your very first pair of socks. So if you are a first-time or prospective sock knitter, or even a more seasoned sock knitter, get comfortable and let's dive in. Hello, and welcome to the Wool Needles Hands Midweek Ramble. My name is Taylor, and I will be your host. This is a video I've been wanting to make for a while now. My intention with this video is not to provide you with, here in this one video, a tutorial on how to knit a pair of socks. My intention is to give you a roadmap or an outline of what to do and what you need to have ready to go to cast onto your first pair of socks. If I've done my job, you'll be able to walk away from this video knowing exactly what you need to get started, both in terms of tools and skills, which skills you're going to develop and learn throughout the process of knitting socks, a few really good solid options for yarns that you can use to knit your first pair of socks, and 2 fantastic resources for developing your very own vanilla sock knitting recipe. I feel like, personally, everybody's opinions are different, but I feel like your very first pair of socks should be your very own custom pair of vanilla socks. You should develop that vanilla sock recipe early. And what does she mean by vanilla socks? Well, what I mean by that is a sock that is simply a stockinette stitch sock. It's a plain sock with stockinette stitch fabric, a basic ribbed cuff. Really, it's up to you what kind of heel you use in your sock, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But other than that, it's just a plain sock. When it comes to knitting a quick pair of socks for yourself and you don't want to follow a pattern, you'll just lean on your personal vanilla sock recipe. And that's what I hope you can leave here with today, is where to go and what to use to help develop that vanilla sock recipe. And then we're going to cap it off with how to care for your socks and a couple of patterns to explore when you're venturing away from a vanilla sock and moving into something that has a little bit more color and a little bit more texture. Honestly, I'm very confident that what I provide you here today is going to give you everything you need to start your sock knitting journey with confidence. Anything that I mention here today in terms of tutorials that I mention or products that I mention are going to be linked down below in the description box. Everything is going to be down there for you. And if you happen to be a Wool Needles Hands Patreon member, you have access to my Millinote board, which is what I use to organize all of my notes for the podcast and for the midweek rambles. All of my links, my own handwritten notes, all of that will be included in that Millinote board. So it's over there for you if you are a member of the Wool Needles Hands Patreon. If you would like to learn more about the Wool Needles Hands Patreon, head over there. The link is down below. See if it's for you. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, before you start any kind of new knitting project, it's important to think about the skills that you're going to need to get started. And when it comes to knitting socks, the necessary skills you want to have handy, things that you want to have some experience with, are casting on, joining to knit in the round, and a bonus if you have experience knitting small circumference items in the round. Socks are a little different than a knit hat. The circumference is so much smaller. And because it's so much smaller, it requires us to think about alternative tools to use or alternative methods to knit smaller circumference items. Now, you may already have experience knitting smaller circumference items like fingerless mittens or gloves or mittens in general. And if you have that experience, you may have experience doing either the magic loop method, double pointed needles, or using 9-inch circular needles. And if you already have that experience and you have those skills in your back pocket, handy, ready to go, you're good to go for moving forward with knitting socks. However, if you've never done either of those, you're going to want to build those skills into your skill set before you embark on your first hand knit sock. And I have some good news about doing that for those of you that really just want to get started already. Now, I'm going to talk about gauge a little bit later in the video, but I'm going to mention it here as well. There is a project that you can create that not only helps you determine your gauge, but it also gives you some initial practice knitting a smaller circumference item so that you can decide if DPNs, magic loop, or 9-inch circular needles are for you. And before I tell you what that project is, I just want to give you a quick look at what each of those different types of tools or techniques are in brief. Double pointed needles, you may have seen these before if you have knitting experience. It's a set of 4 or 5 little knitting needles, just like this, and you use them to distribute a smaller number of stitches in a circle. I'll show a picture here so you can kind of see what that looks like distributed across several double-pointed knitting needles. This is a very traditional technique for knitting small circumference items, and even some that are a little bit larger circumference like a hat. It's just a technique. I like knitting with double pointed needles. It looks way more intimidating than it is. I like holding them in my hand. I like the rhythm of knitting on DPNs, but it's not for everybody. And if this isn't for you, another alternative is using something like this. This is a 9-inch circular needle. It's a small circular needle, perfect for knitting small circumferences. You can see here that all of the stitches would fit along this one small cable, kind of simulating a larger circumference project just on a really tiny needle. It's just so cute. It's a miniature circular knitting needle, and I love it. This isn't for everybody. Some people find it to be kind of awkward in the hand. Other people swear by it because they like that they can just work all the way around the project without having to kind of adjust stitches around several DPNs, or without having to manage the long cables that are necessary for what's called the magic loop method. This is the method that I prefer for knitting socks, and it's a method that allows you to use a circular knitting needle with a really long cable to help distribute the stitches without stretching out the gap between two halves of stitches. This is what the magic loop method looks like. In my opinion, it is not a complicated technique to learn, but I know that it's not for everyone. But the good news is you have 3 methods to choose from when it comes to knitting items of a small circumference, like socks. I will link to 3 fantastic tutorials, one for each method, for each of these things below so that you can learn a little bit more about them and decide which one's going to feel right for you. But the project that I want to point out here that I think is a great one for you to try to help not only determine which one of these techniques is going to work for you, but also to build those skills and also to kind of work as your passive gauge swatch for your vanilla sock recipe is what's called the Easiest Cup Cozy by Gracie Lee Kroll. This is a free pattern, but all it is a very basic tube cuff cozy situation. It looks kind of like the ankle of a sock with a ribbed cuff at the top and a ribbed cuff at the bottom. It uses fingering weight yarn and sock-sized needles. That means a needle that's anywhere from a 0 to a 2, generally speaking. I love this because it's functional, it's practical. You could knit several of these, give them away as gifts, but it's a great way to hone your small circumference circular knitting skills using one of the 3 techniques that I mentioned before, magic loop, DPNs, or 9-inch circulars, and you can use this as a gauge swatch for your vanilla sock recipe, and we'll talk more about that later. So that project, the Easiest Cup Cozy, is a great one to have on hand when it comes to starting your sock knitting journey, because it's going to be a place where you can practice these skills that you need to have ready before you cast onto your first pair of socks. Knitting socks is so fulfilling because not only are you knitting something that is completely functional and practical, but it's also something that beefs up your skill set. There are so many skills that you will learn and develop through knitting a single pair of socks, and you're going to be able to carry over a lot of those skills into larger, more complex garments later on down the road. When it comes to the skills involved in knitting a pair of socks, it packs a really good punch. Some of those skills that you're going to learn are picking up stitches if you're doing a heel flap and gusset, short rows in wrap and turns if you're doing a short row heel, or even if you're turning the heel of a heel flap and gusset. You're going to learn how to do a Kitchener stitch, which is going to close up the toe of a cuff down sock. You're also going to have practice doing basic decreases like slip, slip, knit, and knit 2 together. Not to mention any other special techniques that may come down the road with other future sock knitting patterns that you choose to knit. Now that we know the skills we need to have handy in order to cast on our first pair of socks and some of the skills that we're going to build and develop throughout the process, I want to share with you my own personal roadmap to knitting your first pair of socks. And that's going to begin with the first major source of inspiration for me personally, but I would think for you as well, and that is the yarn you'll be using to knit your socks. Now, some folks may encourage you to choose a pattern to knit first, but because I'm encouraging you here to start with a vanilla sock recipe, your own custom vanilla sock recipe that we're going to talk about later, I want you to start with the medium. I want you to start with the yarn first. There's so much beautiful yarn out there for sock knitting, and it's a great way to get that motivation and inspiration to knit your very first pair of socks. So that's where we're going to start for today's video. When it comes to the ideal sock yarn, you're going to want to knit with something that is natural wool. I would avoid anything synthetic because it just doesn't have the moisture wicking properties that you need when you're wearing it on something like your feet that you might be wearing with shoes and you're going to be sweating, and I think you catch my drift. So you want to stick with something that is woolen. You can have some nylon incorporated into the overall yarn, which is a great way to add durability, and I do highly recommend knitting with a sock yarn that incorporates nylon, but what's most important is that you are using a wool yarn. Now you have a couple of choices in terms of how you care for this wool yarn, and we'll talk about how to care for your socks later, but in terms of the washability of the yarn you choose, you can either choose superwash treated or washable wool yarn or untreated natural virgin wool yarn. One can be washed in a machine, the other must be hand washed, and what you decide to do in terms of washability is completely up to you. If you want the convenience of being able to wash it in a machine, go with something that's superwash treated or that says washable. If you'd like to stick to something more natural, that's fantastic. You can absolutely do that. Stick with something that says untreated, natural, or virgin. A video on my idea of the ideal sock yarn is coming soon, so stay tuned. In addition to the texture of the yarn and the washability and all of that, you're definitely going to want to consider color. Color is a huge motivating factor when choosing a yarn, and that's no different when choosing a sock yarn. Personally, I prefer knitting socks with self-striping sock yarn. I feel like something about the striping that happens automatically as you knit is just so visually stimulating and diverting, and it keeps it from becoming monotonous, which socks can absolutely become a monotonous project, especially when you know that you have to knit two. So self-striping yarn is a really great way to go. This is a self-striping yarn by Nomadic Knits. She's one of my favorite self-striping yarn dyers. I will link to her shop down below. Another one is Tiny Human Knits. She's based out of Canada. Her sock sets are gorgeous. I actually just purchased this one today, which I cannot wait to receive because it's beautiful. Another option is to explore the idea of using a sock set. Now, some might encourage you to avoid using a sock set when you first start knitting socks, and I can understand that because adding a second yarn to the project, a second color, can add an element of complexity that maybe you don't want to deal with on your first go around. But if you're adventurous and you like the idea of adding some additional color, a really pretty sock set is a nice way to go. This is a sock set by Little Lionhead Knits. There's a main color here and a contrasting color here for heels and toes and cuffs or stripes or whatever you want to do. But it's fun. It keeps things interesting. I actually finished this pair of socks, I want to say 4 weeks ago, and I love them. It was a sock set by the same dyer, and I think they're beautiful. So having fun with color is a great way to keep it interesting. Now, the sock yarns I'm mentioning here are a little on the higher end of the budget spectrum. So if you have a tighter budget or you just don't really want to spend that much money on your sock yarn, but you want a really top quality sock yarn, one of my favorite recommendations is Peyton's Croy sock yarn. This is a beautiful self-striping sock yarn. It is 75% wool, 25% nylon, completely washable, and it is an absolute workhorse. You can wash this in the washer, dry it in the dryer, wear it a million times with work boots, and they're gonna last you. This yarn is phenomenal. I'm actually using this to knit my husband's socks right now. This is Peyton's Croy self-striping sock yarn. Isn't that fun? I love it so much. It's such a great sock yarn. If you want something on a budget, or if you know you're going to be knitting lots of socks and you just don't want it to be something that becomes super expensive, it's a really great sock yarn. There's other really great budget-friendly sock yarns like Regia. I know Knit Picks has a few options as well. If you Google budget sock yarns, you're going to find tons and tons of resources and options. So definitely do a little shopping around, but these ones I will link down below in the description box. So we have our yarn. Now it's time to consider the tools that we're going to need to knit our first pair of socks. Now, of course, the first thing that you're going to need is a set of knitting needles, depending on the method that you're going to use to knit your socks. If you plan on knitting with the magic loop technique, you're going to need a circular knitting needle that has a cable that is at least 32 inches long. I prefer prefer to use a 40-inch cable, and here's why. If I purchase a 40-inch cable, I know that that knitting needle will be able to be used for socks, sweaters, hats, whatever. It doesn't matter the circumference, 40 inches is going to be able to accommodate. A 32-inch cable is not going to be able to accommodate most sweaters because my bust is not 32 inches, so it will just automatically be too small. A 40-inch cable covers a lot of projects for me, and it means I don't have to purchase as many different needles. Magic Loop kind of saves you there. Now, if you are going to be knitting on DPNs, you're going to want to purchase a good set of double-pointed knitting needles. I personally prefer these. These are called carbons. They have a wooden shaft and a metal tip. The metal tip helps to get underneath the stitches easily and efficiently, but the wooden shaft keeps the stitches from slipping around too freely. It's kind of the best of both worlds between a wooden needle and a metal needle. I particularly love these, but it will become you'll develop your own preferences, and doing that easiest cup cozy pattern will help you to kind of feel out which tools or knitting needles you're going to need for your first pair of socks. The next thing you're going to need is a set of tapestry needles. One tapestry needle is fine. These are my tapestry needles. I keep this little envelope of needles with me all the time. I'm actually missing one. I don't know where it went. It's supposed to be in here. You can even see where it was. It's so sad. But this is what I use to keep all of my tapestry needles in. This is just an all leather, gorgeous little needle case by Jezebel B, one of my favorite project bag makers. I'll link to this down below, but I love this so much. It holds them all in there in this little piece of felt. I mean, come on, how nice is that? So you'll need some tapestry needles, not only to weave in your ends, but also to do the Kitchener stitch at the very end of your project, because that's how you're going to close your toe. So you need to have your tapestry needles ready to go. You're also going to want to make sure that you have a good measuring tape. Now, I'm sure you have a measuring tape. All knitters most likely do. Having this is important when you're knitting socks because you're not only going to measure your gauge, which can be done with something like a ruler or a more rigid measuring device, but you need to be able to measure the circumference of your foot and the circumference of your leg so that you can figure out the perfect shaping for your vanilla sock recipe. So having something like a flexible measuring tape is really important. This one is by Clover. I can't remember. I think it's called the Shiro measuring tape. It is this, I don't know what it is about that. Measuring tape is a measuring tape, not necessarily. This guy is amazing. It's sturdy. The actual tape itself is just really good quality. It's just such a fantastic measuring tape, and you can't find it anymore. I would link to this on Amazon, but you'll be disappointed because it just shows that it's not available. So if you can find the square Clover measuring tape, yeah, that's a good one to have. So that's mine, but any good measuring tape like that will suffice. You're also going to want some removable stitch markers or stitch markers that open and close, because that way if you're marking off numbers of stitches and the length of your sock leg, or you just want the ease of being able to remove the stitch marker, it's really good to have those removable stitch markers on hand. And then one of my favorite things to have when I'm knitting socks is a really cute progress keeper that I can clip onto the fabric of my sock that helps me see how much progress I've made in one particular knitting session. And I just found these adorable Star Wars inspired, there's progress keepers and stitch markers. You can kind of choose which one of those you would want from Simply Serving over on Etsy. You guys, look at these. They're absolutely adorable. And there's more than just the Star Wars inspired ones. There's tons of them, and they're made with that like polymer clay. I want them so bad. They just are absolutely adorable. So fun progress keepers like that keep the project interesting, dresses up your project a little bit, and it's just little fun doodads like that that keep you coming back to your project. This next one is optional, and I'm not showing you this because I think it's essential that you block your socks. It's because I feel like if you do tend, or if you think that you will be hand washing your socks, these are great for air drying your socks faster. So these are sock blockers. They're wire sock blockers. I purchased my set on Amazon. It comes in 3 different sizes. The size I'm showing you here is for a smaller foot, maybe a child's foot, and then they have a medium size and then a larger size for a larger foot. When you put your socks on these after you've washed them, you can hang them, which I love this hanger because it works on so many different little things as opposed to like a cord or something. You can hang them, and there's so much airflow that goes through here that they dry so fast. Hang them outside and it's like double fast. Who doesn't love that when you really want to get your freshly knit socks on your feet? And then last, and this is a nice to have, not a necessary thing that you have to have, but that's a really nice project bag for holding your sock project. This one is the one I'm using to hold my husband's socks right now. This is by the Magner company. It's waxed canvas and leather, and I absolutely love it. It holds a complete pair of socks in here. It has a little strap for holding on your arm, so you can do some knitting on the go. It's fabulous. I will link to this down below in the description box. I'll also link to this one. I love this one, and I love this project bag company. This is by Prickly Owl Company. She makes beautiful project bags with these really cool tassels. It's a good size for a pair of socks. It's just, I love it. So a nice small project bag to hold your sock project. Again, it just makes it nice. It's nice to have. You don't have to. If you want to put your project in a Ziploc bag, fine. That's fine. But I would encourage you to have something to put your project in that makes it appealing to go back to it, to work on it. Just my personal opinion. It's nice to have. It's not a must-have. Now, we already talked about this already, but now that we have our yarn and we have our tools, we want to set ourselves up for success and figure out what our gauge is going to be with those tools and with that yarn. And this is where you're going to want to knit one of those Easiest Cup cozies. It's going to work as your circular gauge swatch, and it's going to be functional, and you can give them away as gifts. Whatever. It's nicer than having just a bunch of these little random gauge swatches sitting around. So now's the time to check your gauge and see exactly what it's going to be with the needle you've chosen and the yarn that you've chosen. Now, something I didn't mention before, I was using the term sock yarn, and I was kind of using that with the assumption that you would know what I mean by that. But to clarify, sock yarn is fingering weight yarn. This is a yarn that's going to give you roughly 32 stitches per 4 inches on a needle ranging anywhere from size 1 to size 3. We refer to this as a sock yarn. So you have your sock yarn chosen and you have your knitting needles chosen, which can be anywhere from a size 0 to a size 2 if I had to give you my preference. I wouldn't go up to a size 3 only because I feel like the fabric that you get from using a size 3 sock needle for a pair of socks is just too open and too drapey. You need it to be a little tighter to be hard wearing like a pair of socks ought to be. So I would stick with anything from a 0 to a 2. And a size 0 needle is ideal for the cuff, but I think it might be a little too small for the rest of the sock, but I include it in the range because sometimes it's nice to go down a needle size for the cuff of your sock. Now it's time to knit the Easiest Cup cozy to figure out what your gauge is going to be, because you're going to need that information when it comes to developing your vanilla sock recipe, which I'm going to talk about next. Calculate not only the number of stitches you're getting per 4 inches or even per 2 inches, but figure out also how many rounds you're getting per 2 inches or even 4 inches. And those are going to be the key values to have for the next step. We have our yarn, we have our tools, we've done our gauge tube, which is the Easiest Cup cozy, so we also have something functional. Now it's time to actually get to our vanilla sock recipe. I didn't include this in tools, and I really should have in retrospect, but you might want a notebook to have handy because you're going to be writing some numbers down that you can use to develop your sock recipe. Now, when it comes to developing your sock recipe, if you're a person who really loves to follow a pattern and you feel more confident having that hand holding that comes with following a pattern, my recommendation for you is to use the pattern called the One Sock by Kate Atherley. It's not only a sock knitting pattern, it's a masterclass in the construction of a basic vanilla sock. And when you finish that pattern, you will essentially have a recipe for your own vanilla sock moving forward. However, if you want something a little bit more freewheeling, something that's a little bit more open to interpretation, but provides you with what you need to determine your vanilla sock recipe, an article by knitty.com by Kate Atherley, who is the writer of the One Sock. It's called Socks 101, and it's one I recommend all the time. It's an article, not necessarily a sock pattern, but it gives you everything that you need to develop your very own vanilla sock recipe. It's all there, all the calculations, all the math, all the everything that you need to figure out your own vanilla sock recipe. So what I would do if I were you is I would get both the One Sock pattern and check out the Knitty article. Both are linked down below, and decide from first glance which one of those is going to be the one you want to use first in your first foray into sock knitting to develop that vanilla sock recipe. We all kind of learn and adapt to different resources, and so I wanted to give these two options, both by the same designer, if you will, because they're both coming from that same perspective, which I know and I trust. In my opinion, Kay Atherley is just my guru and go-to for all things socks. And I will be doing an entire video on great books for learning how to knit socks and great web tutorials for learning how to knit socks, but Kay Atherley also has a fantastic book on creating your own custom sock recipes called Custom Sock. That's a great one to check out if you're more of the bookish type and you like to have that handheld resource. And those are the resources that I use to develop my personal vanilla sock recipe, the one I go back to time and time again. Vanilla socks are mostly all I knit, and I feel completely confident falling back on those particular resources, the Knitty article being my primary resource every single time I go to knit a sock. And I refer back to them frequently. A lot of the stuff I memorize, but whenever I'm not sure about something, I know exactly where to go. Now, I'm fairly confident that everything I've shared with you up to this point is all that you really need to successfully knit your first pair of vanilla socks. But once you've completed that first lovely pair of vanilla socks that you can wear on your feet, you're going to want to figure out how to care for those socks. And if you're using washable wool, that's as simple as throwing it in the washer and the dryer and you're good. But if you're using a untreated or non-superwash yarn, you're going to want to make sure you understand how to hand wash your socks so that they stay looking nice for years and years to come. I have an entire video on how I hand wash and block my socks that I would love for you to watch. It's a very cozy vlog, a very aesthetic video, but it's one where I share my whole process for washing and blocking my hand knit socks. One thing I do want to recommend here for those of you that are going to be hand washing your socks is my favorite wool wash, which is Eucalyptus. This is a no rinse wool wash, meaning you soak the socks in this and then you remove the water from the socks by gently pressing the water out and perhaps spinning them in a salad spinner. Watch my video, but you don't have to rinse it out of the yarn. It's infused with lanolin, so it adds a lot of those natural oils back into the socks, which you want to have to help increase those moisture wicking properties of that natural wool. Well, we've made it. We've established the skills that we need, the skills we're going to gain. We know the yarn we're going to use. We have our tools. We have 2 solid resources for developing our recipe. We know how to care for our finished project. And now we're ready to venture into something slightly more challenging or with a little bit more variety. I want to leave you with 2 patterns that are excellent ways to venture out into published sock patterns so that you can open your world up a little bit more to all the beautiful designs that are already out there. The first is the Hermione's Everyday Sock. I believe this pattern's still free. It's a hugely popular pattern on Ravelry. It has just enough texture to make it interesting, but it's not overwhelming. You can knit this sock in a really busy variegated yarn with that texture and nothing is lost. It's really a fantastic sock pattern. It incorporates a heel flap and gusset, so it's a great place for practicing that particular type of heel, which in my personal opinion is the best one to knit for your first pair of socks. And like I said, the texture isn't overwhelming. It's really easy to work. It almost is like a vanilla sock with sprinkles on top. It's the vanilla sock of textured socks, in my opinion. You really can't go wrong, and it's a great next step in your sock knitting journey. The next pattern I want to recommend is called the Everyday Socks by Petite Knit. This is a great one if you want to learn the short row heel. I feel like the instructions in this pattern are incredibly easy to follow, and the heel it produces is really beautiful. In fact, I happen to be wearing these socks right now. There we go. The Everyday Socks by Petite Knit. Love these. And what I love even more about these is that they incorporate color changes in the stripes. So you get to play around with color, you get to play around with incorporating different strands of yarn, and you get to work that short row heel. And other than that, it's pretty much a basic vanilla sock. And then the world is your oyster. At that point, you'll be a completely proficient sock knitter, ready to venture out into more complex sock patterns. Trust me, it doesn't take that many socks under your belt to feel confident to work more complicated, complex, and detailed sock patterns. You'll have it all on lock. I have complete faith in you. And that's it. That is the roadmap that I followed to knit my first pair of socks, which I actually have right here. This is one of my very first socks that I made. And I love it. I knit these. Now I tell you about the heel flap and gusset being the first heel you should knit. It was the second for me. However, I wish it was the first because it's just slightly more complicated, and it's good to get that out of the way first. However, it tends to be the best fitting for me personally and for a lot of folks that I've asked, and so it's a good one to know how to do right off the bat. This one, however, I did a short row heel. This is the Fish Lips Kiss heel. If you're interested in this particular short row heel, I would look into the Shadow Wrap heel. It's a simplified version, in my opinion, of the Fish Lips Kiss heel. But this is my first pair of socks. And I knit this pair of socks following the steps that I provided to you here using that Socks 101 article by Kate Atherley. And they came out beautifully. They're a little threadbare. I've worn the heck out of these. And they, what did I knit these in 2017? Yeah, I maybe knit these a little bit before. I think I knit these in 2016. So yeah, they're a little on the old side, not crazy old, but yeah, that's my first pair of socks. And they were successfully completed following these guidelines here. So I hope this provided some insight to you and a little bit of a direction. So as you move forward in your sock knitting journey, you know where you can go. And like I said, I am confident that if you follow these steps and use the resources I provide here and not worry too much about all of the other resources right now, you will have great success knitting your first pair of socks. If you took value from today's video or enjoyed yourself at any point, please don't forget to give the video a thumbs up. Definitely subscribe and click that bell icon so you can be notified anytime I upload new content, which is every Wednesday and every Sunday for the Knitting Podcast. I'm taking a break next week. We're going out of town for spring break as a family, but I will be back with regularly scheduled content the following week. And actually, even though we are taking a break, there is some pre-recorded content that will be popping up on the channel next week. I have a Ravelry roulette that I plan on releasing, so you will have that in between the regular content. But until the week after next, happy knitting, happy making, happy whatever it is that you're doing. Take care, be well, and I will see you soon. Bye!